So first of all, I just want to say thanks everyone for coming along and taking a little bit of time out of your day. Most of you have been before, but for those of you who haven't, this is really just an informal discussion. It's an opportunity to ask questions more than anything else. So if you have any questions, I do encourage you to ask. If you have insights of your own that you'd like to share, then I also encourage you to do so. None of us has a monopoly on insight into the nature of the self. Perhaps some of us have spent a little bit more time paying attention than others, but we all have our own little insights and our own, all have, for want of a better expression, our own path to some extent. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like and add whatever insights you have. And as always, we'll start with a question.
So Stephen, I was wondering about the relationship between our yoga practice and what I might call becoming a better person. Because yoga is, and I get why, seems very self-focused. Working out your own patterns, your own stories, your own narratives, your own issues. Then moving from that to being perhaps that process of becoming a more ethical or more compassionate person, however you want to phrase becoming a better person.
Yeah.
What would the teaching be around that sort of relationship?
It's a really good question, because I think sometimes we can get a little bit, let's say there's a crossover perhaps between the ideas of behaving as a better person or being a better person and being a better yoga practitioner, but whilst I think there's some crossover, I don't think they're the same thing. So from an absolute level, of course, yoga isn't about being a better person, it's about realising that you're not a person at all. And that the person or the personality is a mental construct through which we experience the world, including the people around us. But on an absolute level, it's not what we are. It's like, a simple analogy is it's a bit like a role that an actor plays. The actor plays the role, but they're not the role or the person that they're playing. So I guess in one sense you could say there's no crossover between the two, and yoga is not about being a better person at all. It's just about being free from the idea that you're a person. But I think that sometimes can be misconstrued or can perhaps be not helpful. So if we look at it another way, there's some people in the yoga community worldwide that I think, for want of a better expression, probably subscribe to the fake it till you make it kind of mentality. In other words, they have these ideas of what it is to be a better person, and they try and live up to those ideals. And I guess if you look at the Samkhya yoga tradition, there's more sort of conservative dualistic traditions where the yamas and niyamas, so this is where the yoga of Patanjali comes from. Those yamas and niyamas are actually, we could say in some sense, those ideas of what it is to be a better person. So it's for those who don't know, it's basically a list of 5 things you should do and 5 things you shouldn't do in order to be, to follow the path or to start on the path of yoga, really. And they're things like not causing harm, not stealing, not desiring more than you need, things like being honest, being truthful. And to some extent those things are all very valid and do help us in many ways to become better members of society. I think sometimes though we need to consider that the ideas of good and bad person are usually pretty either personal or society. So what's considered to be good behaviour in one family or one society might be the complete opposite in another society. So we need to be mindful of not falling into the traps of, let's say, individual or cultural ideas of what good actually is. So there are things we could say, and again, if we look at the yamas and niyamas, those basic principles of truth and honesty and not harming and, not being greedy and things like that, they're kind of fairly universal.
So there's a certain consensus universally across all codes and philosophies.
Yeah, and I think whilst we're, as long as we're staying within those sort of basic universal principles, there's nothing wrong with doing our best to apply those principles. Just being mindful that we're not getting into more narrow-minded, limited ideas of what good or bad may be. And so that, I very loosely use the term fake it till you make it to give an indication that we're acting from a place of thinking those are right behaviours without them necessarily being, well, let's say coming from within. It's like an external idea of what is right and wrong action. In the non-dual tradition, and this comes up from a few of the teachers, and I can't remember, I've read it from Nisargadatta, I think, and maybe from Ramana as well, where they talk about, don't worry about any of that at all, just discover the nature of yourself, and then all of these right behaviours and right actions will emanate from you spontaneously, because they're the nature of yourself. Of understanding the connection or connectedness, let's say, between the consciousness within all of us, seeing that it's not separate. And then things like the idea of not harming is a spontaneously occurring action, because why would you want to harm yourself? So I don't think we have to hold, I'm a very firm believer that when we start talking in black and white, we start to get ourselves into hot water. So I think whilst our understanding of the nature of the self and its universal nature and our connection to everyone and everything else is still maturing, then I think it's good for us to have some of those external influence of, or ideas of right behaviour or what it is to be a better person. But I think as our practice matures and our understanding matures, we don't really have to worry about that so much, because it's just what happens naturally. So I think when we come to a deeper understanding of the nature of self, and I could also say when we've talked about this before about our practice is really about resting in presence or in the present. And when we have a deeper grounding in presence, our actions tend to come from a place of right action anyway, because it's our fears or expectations based on past or future that often lead us into wrong action. We're afraid of being hurt, so we hurt others, or we're afraid of what might happen if we do a certain thing, so instead of embracing that change or that circumstance, we run away from it. So there's lots of ways we could look at it, but I think until we have a deep, or let's say a deeper sense of grounding in presence or the nature of consciousness or the self, again, these are all just different words that describe the same thing, a connection to the divine, again, different word for the same thing. Until that point, I think it's good to hold on to perhaps these universal ideas of right behaviour. And they come up in all spiritual traditions. And so, we've talked about the yamas and niyamas, but, you could talk about them, most of us have a connection probably through our upbringing to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and we could look at, the Old Testament idea of the Ten Commandments, or, the New Testament simplification of that, which was, Christ's two commandments: serve and honour God first and foremost, and then love and honour your fellow human beings, and I would extend that to all life around you. These are again universal principles of right behaviour, of seeking a connection to our true nature, to ourself, and then out of that spontaneously arises all those other seemingly external traits. So I think there is a crossover between the two, depending on how you want to see it. So on an absolute level, no, you're not a person at all, so you don't need to worry about being a person. Good, bad or otherwise. And again, understanding that... Sorry? Yeah, right. And I think that's where, you know, as a yoga practitioner, once we start to understand a lot of these ideas of good and bad are culturally imposed constraints, then it does free us up a lot. You know, it allows us to just be the people that we are, to be the little unique expressions
so there's another idea which is authenticity and inauthenticity.
Yeah, and that's why I guess I use the fake it till you make it, because again, you hear a lot of... you know, those of you who've known me for a long time know I love the expression words are nothing but air. Because you hear a lot of people, and this doesn't just apply in the yoga world, this applies throughout all spiritual practices and in humanity generally, people that say one thing and then their actions are at complete odds with their words. And that's where, you know, we need to be very careful of, you know, acting from a place of truth and honesty, and, you know, that word authenticity, which I think gets overused often in the spiritual marketplace. But, you know, we should be acting from a place where our actions and our words are the same, where they're in concert with each other, at least as much as we can. It's not to say we're all perfect. We all still have our human nature, and we will all occasionally, you know, make, I guess you could say, mistakes, but those are opportunities to learn. They're not things to beat ourselves up over, as long as we're not perpetuating the same mistakes again and again and again. So we should, I guess, act from a place of understanding that we are all connected, and initially that comes with a little bit of effort of remembering perhaps, you know, how we should act towards others. But then as our practice deepens, it's just the way we act naturally, because it's who and what we are when we get past our mind and our ego and our ideas. And when we're acting from that place of presence or from the heart, I think right action just happens. And it's only when we're not, you know, really connected, either momentarily or, you know, more long term, to that sense of presence or self or connectedness, that we cause harm to others. And I do it, you know, I think one of the things we need to understand, certainly from a yoga perspective, although it doesn't come up in all other traditions, is that we shouldn't necessarily draw distinctions between right action towards other people and right action towards other living things. Because I think there is, certainly in the world at the moment, there is very much a sense of humanity is, you know, the only life that matters. You know, and that we're prepared to, you know, if you look at the rate of extinction of other species on the planet, you know, it's never been, in the history of this planet, the rate of extinction has never been as rapid as what it is now. And yet the only race that's, you know, burgeoning is humanity. And I think that's because we've separated ourselves from all other forms of life, thinking that we're somehow superior or more important. And that, I think, is one of the greatest challenges that humanity faces, to reconnect our sense of life to all other forms of life, and to recognise that we're not separate. And I think it's something that we need to be very mindful of, that our actions shouldn't just be right actions or good actions or proper actions towards the other people around us, but they should be expressed that way to all living things. Now, others might disagree, and that's okay. But I think that's really important. And I think, you know, I haven't mentioned this a lot for quite a while, but we talk about, you know, the nature of the self as consciousness a lot of the time, and that's one of the words that's often used. And consciousness and intellect are not the same thing, and I think that's where some of this confusion comes from. You know, we think that being conscious or having consciousness is about being able to think or being intelligent. And, you know, if you want to look at it on a really simple level, a plant has consciousness. It knows which way the sun is, it knows which way the water is, and it knows which way up and down are. It's aware of its surroundings and it responds to them. So although it may not have a high-functioning intellect, it absolutely has consciousness. And when we drop into that state of consciousness within ourselves, we recognise that there's actually no intellect there at all. The intellect is something which occurs within, in consciousness, but it's not a part of consciousness. That sense of consciousness or awareness is both much simpler and much deeper and more profound than any intellect could ever be. And I think once we have an understanding of that within ourselves, again, it helps us to interact more compassionately towards all living things. Not just, the people that we interact with. Yeah, not just primates or the ones the pretty animals that we like. Yeah, I mean, look, some of you have heard me say before, if you speak to a marine biologist about dolphins, what they'll tell you is they're rapists and child murderers, which is pretty much
related to us.
Yeah, pretty much. So we think of them as they're dumb, but they're actually, they're animals, and they behave in a very animalistic way. And particularly one of the most common behaviours in, particularly in mating season, is male dolphins. If they find a female that's ready to breed and she's got a pup, they will kill her pup so that they can breed with her, because she won't breed whilst they've got a pup. That's what dolphins do. So, we shouldn't romanticise the natural world or romanticise pretty animals or seemingly nice or smart animals any more than any other animal. A fly or a cockroach is just acting on its instinct, the way it has evolved or created, whichever way you want to think of it. And it's as pure an expression of consciousness as any other animal living in its in its natural way. And that's why I say it's really important that we draw a connection to all living things, not just the people we like or the animals that we like or the trees that we like. They're all part of life.
Of course, excluding
I'd really like to say yes. I'm sure somewhere deep down there, I know that he shares the same consciousness, but it's pretty deeply buried. It is a stretch, isn't it? You need some very, very rubbery arms to reach that deeply.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was great.
So anyway, for what it's worth, thank you. So just because I I have these little analogies that pop up from time to time. We talk about the nature of a yoga practice of being one of, and I've talked about them, we're recognising that we're not the person or the personality, we're something in which the personality exists. So we talk about the ahamkara, the ego mind, or the sense of individuality as being what we need to free ourselves from identifying with, not something we need to destroy or get rid of, but something which we need to stop identifying with. And our identification with it is perpetuated through our engagement and involvement with it. So the more we get stuck in our head, in our mind and our thinking ability, the more we tend to get stuck in our identity with the mind or with the body. And so our practice is one of, learning to disconnect from the mind whenever we don't need to engage with it. And I had the thought today, earlier this week, it was a couple of days ago, who's seen the movie Little Shop of Horrors?
Yes.
Anyone? Who's not seen it? So I haven't seen it for years and years, but basically it's got Rick Moranis and Steve Martin in it. It's a comedy. It's a musical comedy, actually. And basically, you'll be a dentist. Anyway, I won't go down the tune path. We'll have some pretty funny ones. But Rick Moranis is this sort of nerdy guy, and he's got this plant, which, as it happens, I can't remember, is it an alien?
I don't
It looks like a Venus flytrap.
Exact origins.
Yeah, but I don't know that it comes up. But anyway, it looks like a Venus flytrap, and it talks to him. Like it literally talks. And it starts off going, feed me, feed me. And so he's got this tiny little plant and he feeds it, a fly or something like that. And then the plant stops talking to him for a little while, and then he wakes up the next morning, his plant's a bit bigger, and he's going, feed me. And he ignores it for a while, and then he gives it some more food because he's sick of it going, feed me, feed me, feed me. And then it gets bigger, and it ends up this giant, enormous monster that's eating people. And it occurred to me that that's the nature of the ahamkara. It's the monster going, feed me, Sima! And it starts off as this really small little thing, a little thought idea going, pay attention to me, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And it keeps banging on in the hope that we'll feed it. And the problem is that most of the time we give in. We get caught up in that little thought idea unnecessarily, and we feed it. And the more we feed it, the bigger it gets. And the bigger it gets, the more we have to feed it. And so we end up going from a little thought idea that's some irrelevant memory or irrelevant, unimportant idea of something that might happen, and through feeding it we create this massive story, this massive idea that causes harm, that ends up wanting to devour us, which is basically what the plant wants to do in the end. It wants to eat Seymour. And so that's just my little, if you want to think of, the way we interact with the ahamkara, with the ego mind, that's a kind of funny little way to picture it. It's this little thing we've got in the corner that makes the house look nice and helps us to interact with our life. And it needs to be fed occasionally. We need to interact with other human beings, and we need the body to move and go about the actions of day-to-day life. But we need to be careful not to overfeed the plant. Just give it enough so it stays quietly in the corner, looking pretty, doing what it needs to do. But if we overfeed it, it becomes this terrible monster that wants to eat us, that devours us whole. So there's my funny little analogy of the nature of the ahamkara. It's like the plant in Little Shop of Horrors. Because I think it's important that we don't take it too seriously. We talk about this sometimes, how in some yoga traditions it's very serious and very strict and very regimented. And I think when we get into that really serious headspace, it takes the joy out of our practice, and it has the potential to take the joy out of our practice and the joy out of our life. We get into the stage of beating ourselves up every time we fall into one of our little patterns or one of our little ego traps. And we're so serious about the way we interact with other people that we want to try and, again, I talked about, we don't have to kill or stop our ahamkara. There's nothing wrong with us having our little quirky personalities and the things we like and the things we don't like, as long as we're not getting too caught up in them. So we don't have to be serious. We don't have to, spend every moment of every day sitting in Padmasana, with eyes closed in meditation. We can go about our day-to-day life enjoying the nature of experiencing, which is what life is about. It's simply experiencing, with a little bit of humour. So my teacher talks often about we can see life as one of two things, either a tragedy or a tragic comedy. And I want you to think of that analogy as a way to maintain the sense of tragic comedy as opposed to tragedy. Just have a little laugh at it. And we don't have to take our practice seriously, and when we do take our practice too seriously, it becomes drudgery. It becomes very difficult to engage.
The ego kicking in again, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely.
Too serious with too many rules and restrictions. That's actually the mind coming in and trying to control everything again.
Absolutely. It's trying to keep us in the stories of, you're not good enough, you're not paying enough attention, you're not this, you're not that. It's absolutely, as you say, Kate, it's the ahamkara coming back in and trying to reassert its dominance, its control over our mind, trying to direct what we pay attention to, and particularly focusing, as it always does, on those negative thought patterns or seemingly negative thought patterns or negative ideas or negative associations. So you're absolutely right. In the when we maintain a sense of lightheartedness, then the ego is generally in the background. You know, it's got much less of a chance of dominating our actions and our behaviour. Whereas when we're stuck in that really heavy headspace or heavy ideas, that's when the ego much more easily moves in. You know, the nature of consciousness is of lightness or of expansion or connectedness. And you know, when we're happy and joyful and having a little laugh, we all feel that. We all feel a little bit more expansion and connectedness and lightness. You know, it brings us closer to the nature of ourselves, because those are the spontaneously occurring attributes of consciousness. And it's the negative ideas and thought patterns and memories that contract us and take us away from it. And so all the, you know, when we maintain a sense of lightheartedness and joy in our practice and in our life, we're much more closely connected to the nature of the self, to our innate consciousness. So it's good to have these little light-hearted analogies. See the ahamkara just as little plant in the corner. And occasionally you feed it a bit too much, and when you feed it a bit too much, just recognise you fed it a bit too much, have a little chuckle, and then just leave it alone for a bit. So it doesn't dominate.
I feel like that kind of relates to like addiction in society. So then how does that explain then people, once they do end up with a serious addiction, like is there anything like to come back from that? Like is there any kind of yoga explanation for that? I don't know. Or like way of overcoming it?
Look, I think it's a really good question, because I think you spot on. There is a tendency to be addicted to the mind in the same, or to the patterns in the mind, or to ideas in the mind, in the same way that there is addiction to to a phone or social media, or addiction to drugs, or addiction to sex, or whatever else. Addiction is actually, although once we're in some addictions, there's a physiological component to them. Addiction always starts in the mind. You know, in wanting to feel a certain way or wanting to not feel a certain way.
Stephen, what about brains that are damaged though, like psychosis or personality disorders, where there would appear to be less of a choice for those people? Like, is yoga accessible to people like that?
Look, I think it is. I think we just need to simplify it. So again, it's one of those, and I'm not skipping away from your question, because I think these two are related. I think, again, sometimes we get stuck in the idea that if someone's mental capacity is impaired in some way, that it actually prevents them from practicing yoga or from connection to the self, which is of course what yoga is, or connection to our inner peace, we could say, is another way to think of it. I think sometimes we just have to find the right tools, and I think that's where we need to consider yoga isn't limited to certain practices. So we think often of yoga as, it starts with, if you want to go down that conservative path, it starts with the yamas and the arms, and then starts with asana. So, in order to practice yoga, you've got to be able to do certain postures, and then you have to be able to do certain breath rhythms, and then, you have to do this and you have to do that, and you have to think a certain way, and, dress a certain way, and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. And actually, yoga is simply about reconnecting with the self. And so I think we need to recognise that there are lots of ways of practicing yoga. So one way to practice yoga might be to go for a walk on the beach. It might be to sing or to dance, or it might be to paint or to play or listen to music. And I think within all of us, we can find, or within everyone, there is something that will help to connect to that inner stillness or that peace within. And I think it's just about finding You know, for a lot of people, the tools that we teach are very accessible if they're taught well. So we don't have to put our legs behind our head in order to practice asana. We can just do really simple postures and do them well with attentiveness, you know, with paying attention to the little details of what we're doing in our posture. You know, as you've heard me say many times, when we first practice asana ourselves and someone says, you know, extend your arm at shoulder height and reach out to your fingers, and you look down and you're going, I could have sworn my arm was at shoulder height and I was reaching out through my fingers, and you suddenly realise you've got no awareness of what the body's doing. And over time, we cultivate that sense of bodily awareness to know that when, you know, we extend out through the fingers with the arm at shoulder height, that's exactly where the arm is. So we're cultivating our attentiveness, firstly, very consciously. So we actually have to think or look to see that we're doing it, but after a while, we don't need to do it consciously. I can sit with my eyes closed and go, my arms are at shoulder height and the arms are extended, because I've cultivated alertness through regular practice. In the same way, we can cultivate awareness of our breath, just learning to watch our breath and be aware of how it's moving, and recognising that when our breath starts to get out of control, it's a sign that something's happening in our nervous system, that we're starting to perhaps get into a harmful thought pattern, or maybe getting overstimulated mentally, paying too much attention to the mind when we need to just pull back a little bit. You know, all of these things are really just about cultivating alertness to a certain practice. And I think, you know, we talk about how ultimately what we're learning to do is cultivate the most subtle awareness, which is awareness of what the mind is doing. So we're constantly, initially with great effort, but ultimately with no effort, aware of the thoughts that are arising within consciousness, and recognising when we're paying attention to invalid thoughts or irrelevant thoughts. And again, this comes back a little bit to what I was saying about being present or resting in presence. And so I think with everyone we can find something that allows us to be in the present, or helps us to be more in the present. And so for someone with cognitive impairment in some way, shape or form, or with a brain injury, there will still be something that might not be traditional yoga that will help them to just be present. And you guys can probably relate to this as much as anyone. There's things that you know help Mark. You know, and it's not, you know, being in Trikonasana. But there's other things that, despite, you know, having a brain injury, that allow him to be present and reconnect to just being content, being at peace in the moment.
And it's almost too, like, I mean, there's different, you know, talking about psychosis and like all different things, but in some ways, you know, our mental capacity and ability to do things is what gets in the way of that connection.
It's like an inversely proportional relationship.
So it's kind of like, oh, I think you actually have it all over us. I'm going to go sit in your presence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, Mark is so connected to the immediate present moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like utterly connected to it.
Yeah. So, yeah. Whereas all our mental capacity just prevents us from being present.
Yeah.
Because we just get caught up in our thoughts of the past.
Yeah, and that's where I think, you know, when I first read it, this really beautiful quote from Nisargadatta I think it's the end of the 3rd chapter in I Am That. Just the first time I read it, I just broke down in tears, because it was such a beautiful, simple expression of our practice. And he says the mind creates the abyss and the heart crosses it. You know, it's such a beautiful short sentence. It's our capacity to think and our tendency to get stuck in our head that keeps us trapped in that sense of separation from our true nature. And once we get out of our head and reconnect to our heart, to our sense of feeling, to not thinking, we suddenly recognise that sense of presence and consciousness that we thought we were so separate from was there all along, and it was just buried underneath the layers of our mind. The constant obsession with thinking. And so, coming back to your question about addiction, Tia, I think, again, first of all, we need to consider that, I guess a good example was a friend of mine who gave up cigarettes a few years ago, and what he found helped him was having, and anyone who's smoked cigarettes will probably be able to relate to this, a lot of it is habit, and so one of the most powerful tools you can use is replacement. So whenever he was driving his car and he wanted to have a cigarette, he'd get out a piece of fruit and eat a piece of orange or eat a strawberry. And so instead of getting stuck in his old habit, he replaced, the desire was still there, but he simply replaced that desire with something else. And in some respects, we could say that's what our pranayama practice is about doing. When we're talking about learning to disconnect from the mind, from the irrelevant thoughts. You've all heard me say this, we're watching our breath. Let's say it's passive breath, where we're just trying to watch the breath move in, move out, move in, move out. And against that backdrop, we're trying to observe thoughts without engage with them, in the same way that we're observing the breath without engaging with them. And then we recognise after a while that we've started to follow, a little thought came up and we got engaged with it, and suddenly we followed that little thought, 10 minutes into the future, or 10 days into the future, or 10 years into the past. And when we recognise we've done that, we've started to get, I'll use the word loosely, but addicted to that little thought train. We simply replace that thought with watching our breath again. It's really a substitution. And that's what we keep doing. So we keep trying to not smoke, and whenever we find the urge to smoke is really powerful, we do something to substitute. And whilst we're eating our piece of orange, we can't put a cigarette in our mouth. Make sense? And so we're simply using initially a simple process of substitution of one habit for another. I think ultimately when we look at addiction in a broader context, and our addiction particularly to our mind, it comes down again to that sense of, are we aware? Because usually an addiction is based on, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's about wanting to feel something or think something, or the flip side of that, not wanting to feel something or think something. And so it comes back, we talk about this all the time in yoga, that our tendency to get stuck in the mind and all our negative traits and tendencies are based on past and future. Not wanting to feel a certain way because we felt it in the past, and it was unpleasant, or wanting to feel a certain way in the future because we felt it in the past and it was pleasant. Does that make sense? And I think as we cultivate alertness, we start to recognise how often we're living in the past or the future, based on our past experiences. And our practice is not one of, and again, you guys have heard me say this is where I think psychology in a modern context and yoga are divergent. Psychology wants us to recognise our patterns and then analyse them. I'm using this as a broad brush, but essentially that's what it's telling us. You felt, such and such happened in your past. Tell me about that. Tell me all about it. How did that make you feel? Blah, 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 blah. Really trying to, micro-analyse all those experiences. Whereas yoga is about recognising those memories are there, or those projections into the future are there, but simply ignoring them. So recognising that they're there and not trying to push them away. So I'm not trying, this isn't about repression. This is about recognition, but not involvement. So recognising that we think a certain way, we feel a certain way, and maybe we recognise it's based on a specific memory, a specific event, or a specific desire, which of course is based on a past event. So past and future flip sides of the same coin. And once we start to recognise that and cultivate the ability patiently over time to be able to recognise where our mind has gone and then simply ignore it, then we have a very powerful tool for breaking down the psychological foundation for our addictions. And you know, if you look at social media as a really modern form and very pervasive, almost universal form of addiction in many societies, it's based on a false sense of connection. You know, I want lots of people to like me. And so I'm going to put myself out there, you know, to as many people as possible, to get as many people to like me as possible, because I'll feel happier when more people like me. And what's the flip side of that? When people don't like your post or your comment or whatever else, you wonder what's wrong with you. And of course, the even more powerful flip side of that is, you know, the cyberbullying that has become so prevalent, and cyber stalking that's become so prevalent, where people can't get away from those negative tendencies. And I feel really sorry for kids growing up now. I've got friends with, you know, preteen or teenage kids, and I think, man, when I was a kid, things were so much simpler. Go to school, come home from school, go and build a cubby house, go surfing, and then have dinner, watch a bit of telly, go to bed. That was it.
Sounds good.
Read a book. I actually read books more than more than I watched telly as a kid. And now, you know, it's so much more complicated, because we're stuck in disconnection from the present, from our self as presence, and we're thinking that we need to get gratification from someone or something else, from some experience. And that's...
Sorry, I was going to say, Sarah, being a consumer society, capitalist consumer-based society that's driven by craving.
Absolutely.
Constant.
Absolutely. I actually was listening to the radio, listening to the news a couple of days ago, maybe a week or so ago, and someone was talking about, I think it was about Melbourne coming out of their lockdown, and the reporter was saying, oh, everyone's out getting a bit of retail therapy. And I thought, isn't that so bizarre? It's become such an accepted, commonplace thing to think that I will gratify myself and make myself feel better by buying shit. And as soon as the moment of, you know, buying it is over, what happens next? Buyer's remorse. I've worked in sales for years, so I know all about buyer's remorse. Right? There's the moment of satisfaction, and then instantly there's buyer's remorse. Oh, that's like the 5th red top I've got. I really didn't need to buy that, and I could have spent that money on something else. Or, now I want a blue top. Or now I need another pair of jeans to match it. Right? It's this perpetual, this is the ahamkara, and this is the monster plant in the corner that wants to be fed. And the more you feed it, the bigger it gets. And the only way to stop it getting bigger and bigger and bigger till the point it devours you is to stop feeding it. To stop thinking that there's anything you can get or buy or have or do, or any person you can be with, or any place you can go that's going to satisfy you or gratify you. The yoga practice isn't about fulfilling your desires, it's about freeing yourself from them. And that's what I think we miss. And that's something that is so unfortunately prevalent in the modern yoga world, or the modern, you know, pseudo-spiritual world, is, you know, manifest this, vision board that. That's bullshit. That's not yoga. That's the antithesis of yoga. Yoga is not about as I said, it's not about fulfilling your desires, it's about being free from them. Otherwise, you're just making it worse. You're just feeding the monster.
What's a vision board?
I'm so glad you have no idea what that is. I didn't know what it was either until someone told me about it a few years ago. It's where you get like a chalkboard or a whiteboard and you put up, like if you want to go on a holiday to somewhere, you put up lots of pictures of that place. Or lots of, probably some of you know a lot more about this than me because I've never done a vision boarding workshop. But that's basically what, yeah, seriously, I'm deadly serious, this is a thing.
Can we do one here? Can we do one at the shower or a big break?
You can leave right now.
Just be blank.
Yeah, that's exactly right. My the perfect vision board is completely blank. I desire nothing, and there's nothing I desire not to have. Again, we talked about this when we had our little workshop on the weekend. Desire and aversion are of the mind, and the mind is never yours. Once you realise this, you are free. That's the expression of yoga. Being free from desire. Not being attached to things. And again, the flip side of that, not being afraid of things. Desire and aversion, two sides of the same coin.
There's really nothing wrong with desire in that it motivates us to do things. Like if we have no desire, then there's no motivation.
What motivation do you need apart from to be yourself? What do you want to get? What do you want to be?
Like if you have no desire, then you may not even have motivation to get out of bed every morning. There has to be some sort of, I don't know whether desire is the right word, but like passion or
You can have passion without desire though. You can wake up every morning being excited about doing what happens without wanting a specific thing to happen.
Yeah, I suppose it's the interpretation of desire, but to want to do things,
I think
to feel inspired to learn.
Things happen.
I think that's what I was going to say. The nature, life happens regardless.
So I guess if you're not connected to that, then that's when, and that's a mind thing, then if I'm going to stay in bed.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. The nature of the self is consciousness and action. We talk about, in the dualistic traditions, or even in the, in tantric traditions, they talk about consciousness and energy. And the consciousness is the Brahman self, that absolute stillness in which all experiences exist, which is the energy. And again, they're two sides, at least in a manifest sense, they're two sides of the same coin. And if you are connected to the self, you don't need desire because action happens spontaneously.
Yeah.
And as Anna said, I'm just going to stay in bed isn't coming from a place of connectedness to the self, of desirelessness. It's coming from a desire to stay in bed.
But I guess when you're connected to the self, then desire inspiration just happens. It's not.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So inspiration happens, movement happens, action happens.
Yeah.
But it's not based on desire.
No.
So your
I guess it's just what's that?
So I guess your definition of desire is being attached to a certain outcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's, again, if we...
different to being inspired or
Absolutely.
moved.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where in the Bhagavad Gita it talks about, your sphere of influence is with your actions and your actions alone, not with the outcomes of your actions. So this is another expression of yoga. So, and it continues, whatever you do it to the best of your ability, and then be equally happy with success or failure. And when you reach that point of equanimity, where you're equally happy with success or failure, that's yoga. So again, it's not saying we do nothing. It's saying whatever happens, whatever events occur, whatever the day brings us, we do it to the best of our ability. But then we just leave it alone. We're not worried about what comes about as a result of that. So again, no attachment to the outcome or to the results of our actions. There's simply action and then the action of the next moment, and then the action of the next moment. But there's no attachment to past action or to desired outcomes. There's just action in the moment. And these are just, again, from different traditions, these are different ways of expressing the same thing.
Sometimes it's the
Which is it, right?
behind, the intent behind action too.
No, absolutely not.
No.
Because that, if there's an intent behind
That's
action,
what I mean.
it's an attachment to an outcome.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. You know, if there is intent, well, depending on what the intent is it to achieve something or to,
Well, I think an
to
intent
gain gratification or to,
but intent by definition is that.
what's that?
I think an intent, as I understand it, and anyone who's, I'm not claiming to be an English scholar, but I would say the word intent pretty much by definition implies a specific outcome.
Yeah.
So you can't say you're acting with an intention. And again, this is where this comes up all the time in the modern yoga world, and I think it's a great, subtle but pervasive mistake to set an intention. There should be no intention in a true yoga practitioner, because the intention is a statement of desired outcome, and that's the antithesis of yoga. And I know that some of you might disagree with me, and I know there's plenty of yoga teachers who start their class with set your intention, but I'm sorry, that to me is nonsense. You can't practice yoga and have an intention, because that's I desire this outcome, and that's not yoga.
Can you have an intention to have no desired outcome? That's the only desire.
That is the only desire,
The only desire we should have is the desire.
to have no desire.
Yeah, exactly.
You're allowed to have the desire to have no desire.
Yeah, it said that the last desire to leave the yoga practitioner is the desire to have no desire, or the desire to be free from the mind. So all other desires drop away, and the final one is the desire to be desireless. And then once that's gone, you realise that you never needed anything anyway. Because again, desire comes from thinking that we need something else. That there's something outside of ourselves or external to ourselves or in the future or in the past that will make us whole, that will give us what we need to feel content and at peace and connected. And the path of yoga is ultimately about recognising that within yourself you are already fulfilled. You have everything you need to be complete and to be whole and to be at peace and to be present. But it's already within, buried under the layers of the desire and aversion of the mind. And many of you have heard me say in class, a yoga practice isn't about getting something we don't have, it's about getting rid of what we don't need. It's not one of gaining, it's about stripping away to reveal what lays hidden. And there's a lovely little analogy, and I think this comes from a Sufi tradition, I can't remember, so don't quote me on it, but it talks about, and again, excuse the cultural associations or references, but it talks about a husband and wife and their child. And the husband is very, very wealthy, and he wants to make sure that when he dies, his child and his wife will be looked after. But he knows that his wife and his child are terrible with money. So he takes his wealth and he buries it under the house, and he doesn't tell them where it is. And so a few years later he dies, and his wife and son going, man, what happened? He had all this money, and where's it all gone? And they're living, scratching around like paupers, and suddenly someone comes over and starts fishing around under the house and digs up the buried treasure and says, look, it was here all along. And that, it's not necessarily perfectly accurate, as no analogies are, but it's saying that for all of us, we actually have this wealth of riches already here. We just don't recognise that it's there. We don't know exactly how to find it. So we can't say it was ever absent. We can't say we never had it, because it was there the whole time. We just didn't know how to find it. But it was never absent.
Or we didn't look.
We didn't look. And unfortunately that's the way most of society is. We never actually look. Or we start looking and after 5 minutes it gets too hard, and so we just go back to feeding the monster again.
Or we think it's outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
We don't.
It's too far away.
Yeah.
I couldn't possibly find it.
Yeah. We don't think it's us all the
Yeah.
time.
You know, it's that thinking of and that's where the conservative dualistic traditions are about. Enlightenment or connection to the self is a few thousand lifetimes in the future, but it's not. It's now, if we find it now.
But I think we grow up feeling intrinsically flawed in some way, that there's something, we're not enough, there's something wrong with us.
I don't think we intrinsically start that way, but I think we develop that way culturally.
Yeah.
I think we're born with the exact opposite.
Yeah,
I think we're absolutely born complete and whole and perfect.
But from those early years, from conditioning and our sense that we make of the world, that we feel that we're not enough, that there's something wrong with us, because we start to compare ourselves with everyone else.
And that's the nature of cultural conditioning and the nature of the ahamkara. And that's, again, as I said, that our practice is ultimately one of disassociating with that, of recognising that the ahamkara is something which is a necessity for the body to go through life experiencing, but whilst ever we associate with it, then we will get trapped in those stories of not good enough, not smart enough, don't have enough, haven't got enough time, not loved enough, don't have the right circumstances. And it's not until we start to step back from our connection with those ideas of the ahamkara that we have the potential to recognise our completeness, or it's actually not to recognise, but to rediscover our completeness. To remember what we've always been. And Nisargadatta puts it really nicely in one of his later texts. He talks about what's obvious is really easily overlooked. Our consciousness is the first thing and the most subtle thing we experience each morning, and it's the last and most subtle thing we experience every evening. And it's so obvious, it's so ever present that we overlook it. And I was talking about this on the weekend. It's that parable in the New Testament about the guy looking for God in the storm, and couldn't find God in the thunder or the lightning or the waves or the rain or the hail, and when the storm passed, God spoke in a still small voice. Now this comes up in all different spiritual traditions, this idea of don't look for consciousness, the self, Brahman, God, however you want to express it, in external big flashy things, because it's not. It's the most subtle, most profound, most pervasive, ever-present element in everything. It's not flashy.
So I was just thinking just on that, because I'm still very interested in your question about the inspiration to get up in the morning and you connecting that back to Bhagavad Gita, which I think is very interesting because of the idea of actually central to that idea within the traditional sense is devotion. So the idea is your inspiration for life is just to celebrate you're alive. And that is the sort of the central concept behind this, the sort of idea of your yoga practice is a practice of devotion. What are you devoted to? You're not devoted to God, you're devoted to the God within you that is your life. And so that action and all reactions and all, let's say, jobs, activities, roles, things that you perform, you don't perform them for that. You perform them because you're so inspired to be alive, and it's the morning. And so it's like, I love that comes around like that.
And it's also interesting, in the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna is talking about I should just do nothing. And Krishna's saying, no, act. You must act. Like the nature of life is to act.
But the beautiful thing about that is that he's saying, no, you have to kill people.
And
he's saying, no, but surely I'm a yogi, I'm not supposed to. no, you're a warrior, that's your job. And he says, but I don't want to kill everyone. And they say, well, it's okay because anybody's not alive anyway. You're just killing bodies.
Yeah.
You're not killing the eternal, present, omnipresent soul. Because that's going to be all right then. I don't mind slaying 1,000 people.
Yeah. And it's not just killing. It's not just killing anyone. It's like they're his relatives.
Yeah, I know. It's like they're really bad people to kill.
Yeah.
And also, what I love about it is that God is your best friend. He's actually your Uber driver.
Yeah. Absolutely. The charioteer.
Up there on the cross.
Yeah.
Yeah, God's your Uber driver, and he's just
Yeah.
going to have a lovely little chat. And
Yeah.
he's going to tell you to carry on acting anyway, but really don't be attached to it. So,
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's such a fun thing to think about.
And I think it is. It's lovely to bring it back to that sense of devotion.
Yeah, I think devotion is a very interesting word because I thought about it for a long time. Like, what am I devoted to? Why devotion?
Yeah.
Devotees, people that serve others. Interestingly, that the idea of happiness can be gained more from what you offer, what you give, what you can express, than what you can gain or get. Gaining is hoarding, is sitting on and attaching, and giving is to always express
Yeah.
with life.
Yeah, something I sometimes find stuck in my head. I just think, how may I serve? But that within, and often it's like, just go do something really fun. It's like something so lighthearted. It's not this big how may I serve the world. It's just like, how may I serve? What Nadia is, the one she loves about how does consciousness want to express itself in this moment, and so it's kind of that thing it just wants to
dance.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
go do that.
Yep. Yeah. And that's I think again, as you said, and who or what am I devoted to? And I think that's something that, again, I think it's really important for us to recognise the distinction between yoga and Hinduism, because they're not the same thing. So as much as we've got some Hindu iconography around here, because that's a tradition that developed really out of yoga rather than the other way around, well, let's say at the very least we could say parallel to it. I think it's important to understand that the object of your devotion is yours to determine. It doesn't, if you relate to Ganesh, by all means be devoted to Ganesh. If you resonate with Durga, then express your devotion to Durga. If you feel connected to Christ or Buddha, then express your devotion to them. If you feel connected to Mother Nature or to simply the empty universal consciousness, then express your devotion to that. If you find that you're simply devoted to the self within. And Ramana talks about this. He said devotion to God is devotion to the self is devotion to God. Because they're not separate.
This deities thing, like this Hindi deities is so foreign to us, and at the same time we also project onto it the Judeo-Christian idea of a God which is outside ourselves, and actually a deity in a Hindi sense is not that. It's a symbol of an energy, but at the same time we still associate that and feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's so weird. And a lot of Hindus kind of think, what are you doing? Like, you can't actually become a Hindu. Unless you're born one, you can't be one. Like, there's no conversion process you can go through. There's no, baptism or anything like that. Because the Hindus accept all religions in their true sense. It's like these are all just different expressions of God. All our different deities are different expressions of the one consciousness in different aspects, just as, and as a sister and a daughter and a teacher and a yoga practitioner, these are all different aspects of Anna. This is an expression of the divine, this is an expression of the divine, this is an expression of the divine. They're not separate deities, they're not separate things outside of yourself, they're just different elements of the oneness, of the infinite variation within consciousness. Just as all of us, in our seeming individual personalities, are little individual expressions of the one consciousness. Not separate. Just variations on a theme. And ultimately, simply devotion to that which is within, not separate. And so please don't think that, if you've got some, cultural crisis because you don't resonate with a particular, image of what God or the divine is supposed to be, it doesn't matter. Again, this comes back to that overused word authenticity. What is it that you feel devotion to? Is it simply devotion to sitting and stilling your mind? Then be devoted to that. It doesn't matter what the object of your devotion is. If it's coming from a place of no desire for outcome, then it's an expression of genuine devotion. And it doesn't matter what the object is, because all objects are simply different expressions of the oneness. And it's in Autobiography of a Yogi. Has anyone read that? Yeah, it was one of the first yoga story books I read. It's a fantastic story, but Yogananda is talking about his early days where he goes on a little pilgrimage, and his guru doesn't really have much by way, and it's a long time since I've read it, so anyone who's read it more recently correct me. But from what I remember, his teacher doesn't really have a lot of sort of deity kind of devotion stuff, and he goes on a little pilgrimage with some other friends, and they go to this little temple, and there's this sacred stone or sacred rock, and they're all, all his friends are doing their puja to their little, rituals to the sacred rock, and Yogananda sort of going, what's this? And then afterwards, I can't remember whether it's his teacher or another teacher says, "Oh, I noticed you weren't participating in that." And he goes, no, and blah, blah, blah. And the guy says to him, the divine is in that rock as much as it's in you or everything else. So simply honour all things as expressions of the divine, something along those lines. So you can express devotion to the rock without thinking that the rock is God or the goddess or divine or whatever you want to call it. See the divine in all things. And this again comes back to what I said about recognising the connectedness with all living things, and even with things that we don't necessarily think of as living. All of the manifest world is an expression of consciousness, and it is experienced in consciousness and has the potential to reconnect us to consciousness. Not to thinking, but to simply experiencing. And so we talk about, Mother Nature. That is an expression of consciousness, and that's one of the most profound ways that you can reconnect to yourself, I think, is to go and spend some time in nature. And I don't necessarily think practicing yoga in nature, but just being in nature and experiencing being in nature. Because if you're sitting in the forest trying to meditate, there's going to be critters crawling on you and sounds that are distracting and stuff like that. It's actually harder. So don't try and separate yourself from the natural environment. Immerse yourself in it and sit on your mat when you're not in nature. But when you're in nature, that should be your yoga practice, of simply experiencing the smells and the sounds and the sensations of being in that marvellous diversity of experience.
But also that's a lot to do with our separation, like the rishis or the sages of old were actually forest dwellers, and it's sort of like this sort of essential idea that consciousness came out of a complete understanding of nature as a whole, and that as we've progressed through our ages, we've become more and more separate from that, and we're sort of yearning
to reconnect
for that union with the original self, which actually is even possible within our physical beings. Anytime.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We've just sort of chosen to have flaws and walls and stuff like that.
That's right.
So.
But again, there's nothing that can take you, there's no place you can be, however terrible it may be, that takes you away from that which is within. So again, this is where I find it's interesting where you have people go, I want to go to yoga because I hear it's a really spiritual place and I want to find myself there. If wherever you go, there you are. Right? So you don't need to go somewhere in order to find yourself. You are yourself all the time, wherever you are. Don't think that there's some place you have to go, or food you have to eat, or way you have to dress, or all these different things that make you connect, or that give you a connection to yourself that you don't already have. It's those ideas that you need something else to find yourself that stop you from finding yourself now.
Well, it's easier to meditate in a forest than at the top of a skyscraper with disco music.
Possibly. But
so
I think
maybe there could be tools.
There certainly could be tools. But again, we talk about that, and I'll pop this up. Some of you saw on the Debate of My Life social media a little while ago, a couple of weeks ago, about how in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which talks about the forest-dwelling yogis and the ideal hermitage and the ideal practice space. I think what's interesting is they talk about living in the forest, but the practice space is isolated from the forest.
Right.
And I think that's what I was going to say is live in nature or embrace experiencing nature, but practice in isolation from it. Because the nature of nature is to draw us outwards into it. And that's another way of connecting. It's connecting to, let's say, the outward manifestation of universal consciousness. But actually, we connect most easily. And again, this is about, because it's really difficult at first to get out of your mind, to switch off and not engage with thoughts. So we try and have these series of tools to make it easier. And it's much easier to internalize your focus and start to observe the mind when you're not distracted outwardly. And so the ideal yoga practice space is an isolated space, free from distraction, where it's much easier to turn the senses within. When there's more outward distraction, yes, of course, when you have a certain level of proficiency in your practice, you'll be able to sit on the skyscraper with disco music and you'll be aware of the disco music, but you won't be engaged with it in any way. But initially that's very difficult. So we try and create a space that's more conducive to our practice.
Sounds like the shower.
We do have the party house upstairs sometimes. But again, they're simply embracing life. Perhaps not with alertness, and probably with a bit of substance abuse.
We need diversity.
We do need the diversity. And I've mentioned once or twice before Ramakrishna, the little story, he was, if you haven't read anything about Ramakrishna, he's worth reading about. He was a really seriously tricked out guy who spent most of his life in this ecstatic trance, almost connected to consciousness. But there's a story about him, and he lived at the main Kali temple in Calcutta for most of his life. He was the priest there. But there's this story of him being in a rickshaw, going back to the temple one afternoon, and they drove past a pub, and there were all these people really, really drunk, and he was sober, but because of his really, really cosmic, like ecstatic trance state that he's in most of the time, when they drove past the pub and he was watching everyone, he actually started acting like he was drunk, not consciously, but he started taking on that drunken energy. And he actually said, "Bravo, bravo, enjoy yourselves!" And then carried on down the way. That's an expression of embracing life. He wasn't saying, "Oh no, you can't be a yoga practitioner and get drunk and have fun." He's saying these are all expressions of life. Just do it with alertness. Don't be attached to being drunk. When the opportunity to have a drink with friends presents itself and to enjoy yourself presents itself, then do it. Do it with alertness. Don't overindulge. Not repressing, but not grasping either.
Yes, but if you do overindulge the next day, it doesn't matter. Don't go, oh, should I overindulge? It's just like,
That was a good time. Move on.
Yeah, and embrace the headache. And again, this is where we need to understand the difference between some of the very conservative yoga traditions where you don't do this and you don't do that, and again there's very strict rules about what you eat, what you don't eat, what you say, what you don't say, and some of the other yoga traditions which are very permissive but with intelligence. So in particular, I've mentioned before that my teacher and the practice I'm connected to is a tantric tradition, or a non-dual tantric tradition, which doesn't say anything is forbidden as long as whatever you do you embrace with alertness. So it's okay to have a drink, but do it with alertness. Recognise what changes and what doesn't change when you drink. And when you eat certain foods, recognise what changes and what doesn't change. When in every experience, try to recognise the changeless amidst the changing. And this is another way of understanding our yoga practice. The self is changeless and it's within you. So in all experiences, in the diversity of everything you've done and said and everywhere you've been throughout your life, can you recognise the one changeless thing? It takes a very fine-tuned alertness because it's subtle. It's not the waves and the roaring storm, it's the still small voice afterwards. In all the diversity of your experiences, can you recognise the changeless within you? And once you recognise that, you've recognised the self. So that's where, in those tantric traditions, they're using all experiences as a tool, first of all, to express devotion to life, to living life and experiencing the opportunity that we have to taste diversity in all its forms, but also to use that diversity to strip away all of the changing things to recognise the changeless. In the really strict Advaita Vedanta traditions, they use a similar but slightly different tool. They talk about recognising not this, not that. So you recognise everything you can observe, so drawing the subject-object relationship, and anything you can observe is not you. And once you've recognised everything, then what remains, and recognise that that's not you, what remains is you. It's a process of elimination. But it's not different. It's just a slightly different methodology. But it's trying to find the changeless amidst the changing, or finding what remains when everything that you observe has been taken away. So just different tools from different traditions. And for some of us, different tools make more sense, are more readily accessible, make it easier for us to tap into the ever-present consciousness within. And that's where, as I said, our yoga practice, I believe, should be what works for us. We don't have to stick to a specific set of tools or practices or a specific tradition. We use what is most effective for helping to break down the association with the ahamkara, with the mind and the sense of individual identity, and what helps us to reconnect to the universal changeless consciousness within. And if for you that's putting your headphones on and playing Swedish black metal for 3 hours a day, then do it. It doesn't matter. The experiences don't matter. The tools don't matter. What matters is whether they bring us closer to consciousness or not, or whether they just tie us in more and more to the ahamkara. And that's what our practice is. We keep saying, keep going back to the same thing, because we need to hear it again and again and again and again and again until it sinks in. Until at some point, we have little moments of insight which simply allow us to let go of something. And the more things we let go of, the more easily we see what remains ever present beneath.
And then you end up as a better person.
And then you end up as a no person, but as a seemingly better person. As my teacher says, his teacher said to him, the refined or polished ego is one with God. So it's such a beautiful expression. We don't let go of the ego, we just polish it and take away all its past and future desires and aversions, and what remains is simply a pure expression of the divine in the present, which causes no harm, which speaks from a place of truth, which doesn't grasp, doesn't want, doesn't desire, but simply embraces life with devotion to life itself, to simply living and experiencing without attachment to outcome. And then what else is there to need or to do? I think that's plenty for tonight. So as always, remember the words you hear from myself and others are like little seeds that get planted and they sprout in their own time. So it doesn't matter if it doesn't all make sense now, or some things don't make sense now. There are plenty of things I've heard said for 10 years before it suddenly clicked, or things I forgot until in a momentary experience I suddenly remembered them because they made sense in the moment. So it doesn't matter. We're not trying to intellectualize our practice, because of course that is just getting trapped in the mind again. You can't think your way out of the mind. So just let the practice be what it is, and just the only thing we need to do is simply try as much as we can to come back to presence, to observe when the mind is acting from a place of past or future, from a place of desire or aversion, and over time, with patience, with compassion, allowing the irrelevant thoughts, the past and future, to have less of an effect on our actions in the present, until such time as they no longer have any effect. The memories remain, but there's no longer a residual effect from them. And I'll finish with a lovely little analogy that comes up in a few of the texts I've read about a burnt piece of cloth lying on the ground. It still has the shape of the clothing that it once was, but you can't wear it. It no longer has any substance. And so that is an expression of the polished ego. It still looks like a person, but you can't wear it. It has no substance. And that's our practice. So thank you very much for coming along. It's lovely to share with you all. And thank you very much for your donations to the Homeless Hub. It's lovely for us also to be nice people,
Yes.
and to give to others at a time when there are plenty of people who have much less than we do. So to recognise that in doing, not because we want to feel good in ourselves, but recognising that simply right action is to share the abundance that we have, without the desire for thanks or gratification, but simply because it's the nature of the self is to help the self. Thanks very much, folks. Catch you next time.